With pending disasters approaching like hurricanes or in the aftermath of a major event like an earthquake, it's not unusual to see people rushing grocery stores and supermarkets scrambling to stock up on basic supplies they'll need to survive. Though getting supplies is important, going to grocery stores and supermarkets during a disaster is actually a really bad idea. Since preparing for a disaster is not something that most people will do, you can expect these stores to be full of unprepared, desperate people scavenging the remains of the depleted shelves and inventory. This makes these locations a dangerous place to be, as you can almost always expect chaos in an unruly crowd that is teetering on turning into a mob when even the simplest scuffle could push them over the edge. However, grocery stores are just one of the several places you'll need to avoid before or after a disaster. In this video, we'll discuss the places to avoid when disaster strikes and how you can prepare in advance so that you don't need to go near these locations we'll cover. Five places you'll need to avoid during a disaster. Number one is grocery stores. As already mentioned, going to grocery stores and supermarkets is a really bad idea since you can expect a mob of desperate, unprepared people, which presents a huge security risk to you. With so many people trying to get the same basic supplies like food and water, grocery stores won't have enough stocks to accommodate all of the demand. With a limited supply of goods, most people will be mentally distressed during a disaster, and it won't come as a surprise to anyone if they become violent or aggressive in trying to get vital supplies. This makes these type of locations probably the most dangerous in these moments. The sudden surge of people and demand is not the only problem as to why supplies will be scarce. Most, if not all, grocery stores and supermarkets in the U.S. use what we call a just-in-time delivery system in getting the stocks for their respective stores. This type of system basically provides stores with only enough stocks that they will need for a typical day, making them susceptible to sudden demands like during a disaster. This is why even if there is an unexpected disaster, stores simply cannot adjust their stocks and order more at the same level of demand, since the just-in-time system relies on a delicate and complicated process, making it almost impossible to scale up quickly under these types of unexpected load. In order to avoid going to grocery stores during a disaster or just prior to it, you need to prepare in advance. It's important that you have a stock of food that are not easy to perish, as well as clean water in your home, even if there isn't a disaster approaching. The reason for this is that disasters can happen anytime and without warning. So if you're not prepared, you'll be scrambling for supplies like everyone else. When getting food and water, it's important that you at least have a 2 weeks worth of supplies, since you'll never know how long a disaster will last or when help will arrive. Make sure that you have separate clean water used for cleaning and another one for drinking. Also, make sure that your home has an ample space to store at least a minimum of a 2 weeks worth of food and water. You should also consider that power might go out, so you might need a small generator to power your refrigerator so food won't go to waste. Number 2, banks. Another dangerous place to be during a disaster are banks, especially at ATM machines. In this cashless age, people are becoming more reliant on using credit card or debit cards for their transactions. And why not? They're more convenient and they beat carrying cash in your wallet. But during a disaster, cashless transactions will be impossible since there will likely be communication and electrical outages. Stores simply won't have the capacity to accept credit or debit card payments since the terminals that process the transactions will likely not be functioning. ATM machines won't be working as well since they require electricity and a line of communication with a bank to function. One example of this is when Pacific Gas and Electric (PG&E) and Southern California Edison decided to cut power to the majority of their customers for several days to prevent the risk of wildfires just recently here in California. Since ATM machines and credit card terminals rely on electricity to function, it was advised that residents affected load up on cash prior to the power outage. There's a possibility that ATM machines could be affected by the power outage, and this caused residents to line up at ATM machines to withdraw as much cash as they could. Another example is after Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico. One of the effects of the strong hurricane was that there was an electrical and communication outage in the entire country, making many ATM machines useless. Stores and merchants also were unable to process credit or debit card payments during that time, making the country rely on cash-only transactions. This was problematic, especially for those who were unable to load up on cash prior to the disaster. They couldn't purchase important supplies from stores that were open since they couldn't use their credit card or debit cards. And at the places where ATM machines were functioning, the lines were extremely long. The cash supply on these machines, by the way, is not infinite, and not everyone who lines up is going to be able to get the cash they need, so prepare for that in advance. To avoid having this kind of problem during disaster, it's important that you always keep cash on hand. Make sure you prepare an emergency cash supply in your house that you only access during a disaster. This will ensure that you'll have the ability to purchase things in case you need it and you have the means to pay for it. Make sure that the cash you prepare is broken down into several amounts. Remember, stores likely won't have enough cash on them to constantly give out change for the payments they receive. Breaking down the amount of money that you have into smaller amounts gives you the ability to pay in the exact amount, eliminating the need for change and also shortening the time you spend in the store. Number 3, drugstores. A huge portion of the country's population is reliant on prescription medications. This means that there will be many Americans who will line up at drugstores prior to and after a disaster as they try to get refills for their prescription medicine. About 46% of the country's population takes prescription drugs. That is a huge number, which shows that almost 1 out of 2 Americans are reliant on some form of prescription medication. The problem here is that not many of the people who take prescription drugs prepare or plan ahead in case of a disaster. In addition, most pharmacies only will refill up to a limited amount of medication, forcing patients to return frequently, making it very difficult to stock up. A 2018 survey showed that more than half of the population, 53%, don't have any preparation plans in case of an emergency. The survey showed that 25% of Americans say they can only go without their drugs for 2 to 3 days before any negative health effects are felt. This also shows that when a disaster strikes, there will be many Americans lining up at drugstores trying to get prescription medications that they need. Though there are already programs in place that allow pharmaceutical companies to respond properly during disasters, it won't be uncommon for drugstores to have long lines or run out of inventory, especially if drugstores also use the just-in-time delivery system for their supplies. Like point number 1, when this happens, expect people to get desperate. Aside from the long lines and inventory running out, most drugstores that are open during a disaster won't be able to process any other forms of transactions other than cash. This could be a problem for people who weren't able to prepare enough cash for their medications. And as mentioned earlier, when people are in a stressful situation, they become mentally distressed, experiencing depression, anxiety, or even post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Couple this with the desperation and feelings of having their personal safety and well-being threatened, they could commit violent acts just to get their medication. One thing that you can do to avoid going to drugstores during an emergency is to stock up on medications and other medical supplies and equipment you might need ahead of time. You need to make sure that you are also prepared to be able to store your medicine, especially if the medicine you're taking requires being put in a refrigerator. You also need to consider as well how much medicine you are allowed to purchase, since there's a limit for certain prescription medications. Another thing you can do is consider finding a natural alternative to the medication you are taking, or you will likely take. Number 4, high-density population areas. If you live in a high-density population area like an apartment building, high-rises, or downtown areas, then it is even more important that you are prepared for disaster. This is because high-density population areas are one of the most dangerous places you can be and you need to avoid during a disaster. One of the main issues with high-density population areas is that it is filled with a whole lot of people that are probably not prepared to survive beyond a few days at best. And in a disaster situation, people are also going to be one of the biggest threats to your safety and security. The chances of social unrest and crimes in these areas are high, especially if supplies are limited and help is nowhere to be found. In apartments and condominiums, the threat is increased since people live close to one another. It makes it much easier for others to try and break into other units to steal supplies. Other apartment units even have multiple families living in one unit, making prepping very difficult. Apartment complexes and condos are often good targets for marauders since they can raid many units in just one building, allowing to possibly get more supplies from people living in the building. This makes security and protection one of the primary concerns if you live in an apartment complex. Another problem you'd experience in high-density population areas is that it doesn't really provide much space to properly prepare. Apartments and high-rise condos typically don't have big spaces, making them problematic for storing supplies and tools. Most apartments only have enough space to fit in a bed and furniture for the tenant, making prepping for a prolonged period of time difficult. If you're sharing a unit with multiple families, then prepping is already out of the question unless you trust them enough to prep with you. In these type of environments, you need to be creative when it comes to maximizing the space in your apartment and finding areas where you can store the supplies you prepared for disaster. Also, give serious consideration to getting a backup storage unit nearby where you can put critical supplies as a backup. Aside from security and storage concerns, another problem with living in a high-density population area is that the concentration of people in this area makes it more vulnerable to injuries or death when a disaster strikes. The congestion, dense infrastructure, and limited escape routes make it harder for people to survive in this kind of area once a disaster strikes. One example of this is in the Haiti earthquake in 2010, where the magnitude 7 earthquake hit a densely populated area, contributing to many deaths and injuries to people. Also, in the aftermath of a major event, keeping up with sanitation will present a lot of challenges, and it lends itself to fast proliferation of disease and illnesses. Though it is still possible to prepare for disaster, even if you live in high-density population areas, the best solution is to bug out of these areas if possible before a disaster strikes. These types of areas typically present many risks and dangers, and trying to ride out a disaster is usually not your best option if you're living in an overly congested area. You also need to have a bug out plan in case you live in these types of environments. Have a plan on how you will evacuate the area, where you'll go, and how you'll get there. Make sure that you have enough supplies prepared for your bug out trip. Number 5, gas stations. Similar to grocery stores, banks, and drugstores, people will be lining up at gas stations prior and after a disaster to make sure that their vehicles will have a full tank of gas. The main reason for this is that they want to make sure they have enough gas to get out of town in case they need to do so. The problem is that gas stations in disaster areas typically run out of fuel. An article showed how quickly gas stations run out of fuel after a disaster has been declared in an area. When an emergency was declared for Hurricane Michael in October 2018, the first day of the declaration resulted in 13% of the total gas stations exhausting their fuel supplies. By the time the hurricane made landfall, about 35% of gas stations were already out of fuel. The trend lasted for 7 days after the emergency was declared. It was even worse during Hurricane Florence in 2018 and Irma in September 2017. 5 days after the emergency was declared, 69% of gas stations in the areas affected by Hurricane Irma were already out of gas. When Hurricane Florence hit, 73% of gas stations were already out of fuel. This made it extremely difficult for other people to find gas stations to fill their vehicles. If you aren't prepared, you may find yourself without gas in your vehicle during a disaster, making any bug out plan you have more difficult. To avoid being in the situation, the best you can do is to prepare ahead of time. One of the things that you can do is try, as best as you can, to maintain your gas tank above 1/2 full all of the time. Doing this will give you extra fuel to use when you're looking for gas stations that still have fuel. Make sure you always have an ample supply of fuel in your vehicle, and also ensure you don't just get stuck somewhere without fuel when disaster strikes. Another option is that you can store as much fuel as you can in your home so that you don't need to go to any gas station to refuel your vehicle's fuel tank. Obviously, be sure to study how to properly and securely and safely store your gasoline. Disasters can happen anytime and anywhere, unannounced and without warning. Most people are caught off guard by these disasters, forcing them to scramble for supplies and other items they will need to help them weather the disaster. But since many people will likely do the same, going to places like grocery stores, gas stations, drugstores, and banks, just be sure that you don't go to these locations, since the sudden influx of people can make them a potentially dangerous place and very hazardous. To avoid being put in this situation, it's important that you already have a plan in place so that you don't need to scramble for supplies and items. If you enjoyed this video, please click on the like button, share on social media. If you have any suggestions or any additional feedback, please place that in the comment section below, as I always learn so much from the community. As always, be safe out there.